Narrator, low, suspenseful. In the year 1859, deep in the red clay fields of Georgia, there was a plantation feared even by other plantations. Overseers said it was cursed. Workers whispered that something walked at night, but few knew the truth. The truth about an enslaved man who turned terror into strategy, fear into power, and silence into a weapon. This man, whose real name was erased from documents, learned something the overseers never expected. A tactic so clever, so unnerving, that it left 19 of the cruelest men on the plantation powerless. Some called it witchcraft, some called it a haunting. But what he used was far more human and far more terrifying. Tonight, we uncover the hidden tactic, the one that flipped the balance of power in the most dangerous place in America at the time. A tactic born from desperation, shaped by suffering, and executed with chilling precision. So sit back, turn down the lights, and step with me into the shadows of Georgia 1859, where one enslaved man changed the rules of fear forever. The tactic began as nothing more than a whisper among the enslaved quarters, a rumor that one man had learned how to use the overseer's own fears against them. In a place where brutality ruled every hour of the day, even a small psychological edge meant survival. But what he crafted was far more than a small edge. It was a silent, calculated understanding of how the overseers thought, what they feared, and how panic spreads through a group of men who believe they control everything. He observed them with the patience of someone who had been forced to study danger his entire life, watching how they reacted when the wind shifted at night, when shadows moved between the trees, when one of their own shouted warnings that nobody else heard. He noticed their cracks, the moments when authority slipped and superstition took over, and he began to shape those cracks into something he could use. What made his method truly powerful was that he never revealed himself. The overseers never saw him acting, never caught him in the middle of anything, never found a single trace that pointed back to him. Everything happened indirectly, quietly, almost invisibly. He used the land itself as a tool, knowing its hidden corners better than the men who claimed ownership over it. A bent branch, a loosened latch on a gate, a distant echo carried through the night. Small details that meant nothing by themselves, but created an unsettling pattern when repeated. To the overseers, it felt as if the plantation had gained a mind of its own, one that followed them, listened to them, and answered their cruelty with warnings they couldn't explain. The man's tactic relied on patience, strategy, and a deep understanding that fear does not need a face to take root. It only needs the suggestion of something watching. He also used timing as a weapon, choosing moments that struck where the overseers were weakest. When they were exhausted, he created noise. When they were confident, he created doubt. When they bragged to one another about their control, he took some small piece of that control away. He learned that the overseers feared the unknown more than any physical threat. They feared the nighttime paths they rarely walked, the abandoned sheds that made strange sounds, the stories told by older workers about spirits wandering the woods. He fed those fears deliberately but subtly, making sure each overseer felt singled out, as if something unseen had chosen them. No two events were the same, so they couldn't attribute them to coincidence or trickery. Over time, the overseers became jumpy, suspicious of each other, unable to sleep through the night without jolting awake at the smallest creak of the floorboards. The brilliance of his strategy lay in how deeply it affected the overseers' minds. Men who once walked with whips at their sides now hesitated before stepping outside after dusk. They argued among themselves, each believing another overseer was hiding information or orchestrating some private scheme. Their unity, the foundation of their authority, weakened day by day. The enslaved man understood that physical rebellion would be crushed instantly, but mental unraveling was something the overseers couldn't fight with guns or chains. They couldn't attack what they couldn't see or identify. They couldn't punish someone when they didn't know if the threat was human, supernatural, or imagined. His strategy transformed the plantation's atmosphere, making fear spread in directions no overseer had anticipated. What made this tactic unforgettable was not just its effectiveness, but its invisibility. To outsiders, nothing seemed unusual. The fields remained the same, the buildings unchanged, the routines unbroken. But within the overseers' ranks, paranoia bloomed like wildfire. Their authority didn't collapse all at once, but eroded slowly, one unsettling moment at a time. The man orchestrating this shift never stood in the open, never confronted anyone directly, never allowed himself to be suspected. He simply observed, planned, and acted with precision that came from years of forced silence and sharpened survival instincts, turning the very landscape into an ally and transforming the overseers' confidence into their greatest vulnerability. The 19 overseers on that Georgia plantation were not ordinary men. They were chosen for their reputation, for their willingness to enforce cruelty without hesitation, and for their loyalty to the plantation's brutal hierarchy. Each one carried a history of violence that made the enslaved population fear them by name alone. Yet, despite their hardened exterior, each of these men also carried private anxieties, buried insecurities, and superstitions inherited from childhood. They strutted across the fields with confidence during the day, but at night, their bravado melted into sharp glances over their shoulders, tight grips on lantern handles, and restless pacing in their cabins. The enslaved man who studied them understood that cruelty often masks fear, and that even the strongest facade cracks when the right pressure is applied in the right place. These overseers came from different backgrounds. Some were former soldiers, others drifters looking for work, and a few were sons of plantation owners who wanted power but lacked discipline. They did not share trust. Instead, they existed in a fragile alliance built on mutual benefit. Each overseer believed he was superior to the others, creating an undercurrent of rivalry that made them quick to suspect betrayal. The enslaved man exploited this fractured dynamic masterfully. When one overseer heard an unexplained noise behind his cabin, he assumed another man was mocking or provoking him. When another overseer found tools misplaced or doors ajar, he blamed his fellow overseers before blaming the enslaved workers. These suspicions acted like sparks, igniting tension among the 19 men, and pushing them further into paranoia long before any real threat emerged. The cracks between them widened naturally, needing only the smallest nudge to grow into deep divides. Individually, each overseer had a weakness the enslaved man quietly discovered. One drank heavily to dull his nerves, making him easy to manipulate with subtle disturbances. Another suffered migraines that flared under stress, so small changes in routine or environment sent him spiraling into agitation. A third believed strongly in local ghost folklore, so any unexplained event near the woods reduced him to trembling silence. The enslaved man collected these vulnerabilities like pieces of a map and began to guide each overseer down a path of growing fear. No single event was overwhelming, but each one was chosen with precision, targeted at the overseer who would react most dramatically. Little by little, the overseers lost their sense of control, each convinced that something unique and dangerous was following him alone. As fear escalated, the overseers turned inward rather than outward. They stopped patrolling together at night, choosing instead to stay close to their own cabins, leaving gaps in the security of the plantation. They questioned each other constantly, sometimes even raising their voices or drawing weapons when accusations felt too sharp. The enslaved population watched silently as the overseers' unity cracked like dried clay, but they did not interfere. The enslaved man orchestrating the strategy ensured that every unsettling incident remained ambiguous. No clues, no patterns, nothing that could be traced back to a single source. As a result, the overseers' suspicions rarely aimed downward toward the workers. Instead, they targeted each other, their paranoia pushing them into isolation and mistrust. Each man began to wonder whether one of the 19 was secretly turning against the others, a thought that ate at their nerves day after day. The true brilliance of this unraveling lay in how evenly it struck across all 19 men. Each overseer felt singled out, yet none realized that the same pressure was being applied to everyone else as well. They began sleeping with weapons close to their beds, locking doors that never needed locking before, and jumping at sounds they once ignored. Their authority weakened as their fear grew, their confidence replaced with dread they could neither confront nor understand. What started as a group of intimidating enforcers slowly transformed into 19 isolated, uneasy individuals, each haunted by the belief that something or someone had marked them specifically. Georgia in 1859 was a place where fear had layers, where cruelty was woven into the soil as deeply as the cotton roots that fed the plantation's wealth. The landscape itself seemed to trap sound, holding on to whispers, footsteps, and distant cries as though the land remembered every act committed upon it. The heat pressed down on the workers like a heavy hand, while the nights brought a darkness so complete it felt alive. Plantations operated as isolated worlds, governed not by law but by the whims of overseers and the unspoken belief that brutality kept order. In this environment, every enslaved person learned quickly that survival depended not just on strength, but on perception, knowing when danger approached, when tempers flared, and when silence was the only safe response. For the overseers, the fields were their kingdom during the day, but at night, even they felt the weight of the land's history pressing in on them. The year 1859 was especially tense across Georgia. Rumors of rebellion circulated constantly, amplified by the paranoia of slaveholders who knew their brutal reign could crumble if unity ever grew among the enslaved. Laws tightened, punishments became harsher, and overseers doubled their vigilance. Yet beneath the overseers' cruelty lurked their own haunting knowledge. They were vastly outnumbered by the people they tormented. This reality created a constant undercurrent of fear, though never spoken aloud. The enslaved man, who would later outsmart 19 overseers, understood the significance of this tension. He recognized how the overseers flinched when they heard hushed voices, how their eyes darted across the fields when they sensed even the slightest shift in mood. He noticed the way they reacted to news from neighboring plantations, escape attempts, unexpected accidents, whispers of unrest, each story fueling their dread that one day their authority might break. The physical environment of Georgia added another layer to this psychological atmosphere. Dense woods bordered many plantations, filled with thick underbrush that muffled movement and created illusions in the moonlight. Tall pines creaked in the wind, and the cries of unseen animals echoed through the night, often mistaken by the overseers for something unnatural. Swamps nestled in low areas, producing fog that crawled across the ground and made familiar paths look haunted. The enslaved man knew these lands intimately, navigating them with ease born from necessity. The overseers, on the other hand, avoided them whenever possible, fearful of both the terrain and the stories passed down by workers about spirits wandering the woods. Georgia's wilderness became an unspoken ally for anyone who understood its rhythms, and the enslaved man used that understanding as part of his growing strategy. The social environment was just as dangerous. Overseers carried themselves like tyrants in daylight, but the plantation's isolation magnified their anxieties. They trusted neither the workers nor each other, forming uneasy alliances based solely on shared authority. The enslaved population, though forced into silence, communicated through glances, gestures, and coded words, weaving a network of understanding that overseers could not penetrate. The enslaved man watched this dynamic quietly, learning when overseers were alone, when their routines shifted, and when their fears were closest to the surface. He understood that the plantation's hierarchy depended entirely on the overseer's collective confidence. If that confidence cracked, the entire structure would tremble. By 1859, the perfect conditions for psychological disruption already existed: tension among overseers, fear of rebellion, unfamiliarity with the land, and the weight of long-held superstition. Georgia's plantations had become pressure chambers where fear could be shaped and directed with the right touch. The enslaved man recognized that he did not need weapons or open defiance. He needed only to guide the overseers deeper into the fears they already carried. The year, the land, the silence of the nights, and the history soaked into every pathway all combined to form a landscape where one person, armed with knowledge and patience, could exert power in ways the overseers never expected. Psychological warfare became the enslaved man's most potent resource, not because it required force, but because it required understanding. An understanding of how fear settles into a person and quietly reshapes their behavior. He knew that fear did not need physical proof to grow. It only needed suggestion. A shadow left where no one expected it, the faint sound of something moving through the woods, or a misplaced object that should have remained untouched could trigger a chain reaction inside a man already worn by stress. The overseers relied on control, on being the ones who dictated every rule and every punishment, so even a small interruption in routine made them uneasy. The enslaved man recognized these vulnerabilities and learned to press on them gently, creating uncertainty that spread slowly but relentlessly. He crafted disturbances that were subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence, yet unsettling enough to linger in the back of each overseer's mind. Fear and superstition ran deep in the overseers, partly because many of them grew up hearing stories about spirits in the woods, omens in the wind, and curses tied to the land. Outwardly they mocked such beliefs, but inwardly they carried remnants of those childhood warnings, especially when darkness fell. The enslaved man understood the power of these beliefs and used them as a foundation for his plan. A sudden noise near the tree line might remind one overseer of a tale from his youth. A piece of fabric tied in the wrong place could be interpreted as a sign. The unexpected silence of the workers during a nighttime patrol could feel like a gathering storm. None of these actions were direct threats, yet each one stirred the overseers' imaginations, leading them to fill in the gaps with their own fears. This was the essence of psychological warfare, letting a man frighten himself with possibilities more terrifying than any weapon. As the overseers' imaginations spiraled, their behavior shifted in noticeable ways. They became more cautious, sometimes stopping mid-sentence to listen for sounds no one else heard. Their patrol routes changed from confident strides to hurried walks, their eyes constantly scanning the edges of lantern light. Conversations among them grew sharper, as each man suspected the others of withholding information or playing tricks. The enslaved man recognized these changes as victories. Every suspicious glance, every sleepless night, every whispered complaint indicated that his strategy was taking root. He did not need to confront them directly. He only needed to guide their minds toward the fear that already lived inside them. Over time, the overseers became prisoners of their own thoughts, locked in a cycle of anxiety that made them more dangerous to each other than to anyone else. The more unsettled they became, the more mistakes they made. Overseers would misplace tools and assume someone moved them. They would hear branches snapping and interpret it as footsteps. A flickering lantern became a sign of something lurking just beyond the light. These reactions came from the overseer's inability to separate imagination from reality once uncertainty had taken hold. The enslaved man deliberately fed this confusion, not through bold actions but through carefully timed moments that nudged the men deeper into paranoia. A door left slightly open, a path swept clean when no one was seen nearby, or a whisper carried by the wind during an already tense night pushed them further into mistrust. Their nerves frayed, and even routine duties became battlegrounds between logic and fear. What made this psychological strategy so effective was its invisible nature. The overseers could not fight what they could not see, could not punish what they could not prove, and could not regain control when they did not understand how they lost it. Each man felt watched, but by something he could not name. Each man believed he was singled out, though the pattern spread evenly across all of them. Their authority, once absolute, weakened as doubt crept into every decision and every interaction. The enslaved man had turned their own minds into the battlefield, allowing fear, superstition, and imagination to do the work that direct rebellion never could. What made this story feel like a historical thriller was the way real-world terror intertwined with the kind of folklore that seeped through the American South during the 1800s. The plantation was not just a place of forced labor. It was a place shaped by stories told in whispers, by shadows that stretched across the fields at night, and by an atmosphere thick with suffering and superstition. The enslaved man's actions unfolded within this world, where every unexplained event gained a supernatural undertone simply because people expected the land to hold secrets. Overseers who prided themselves on strength and dominance found themselves facing fears they could not put into words, and the enslaved population, though oppressed, had always understood that fear could be a powerful force if directed correctly. The blending of historical reality with eerie undertones created a setting where psychological battles felt as dangerous and as visceral as any physical confrontation. The South in 1859 was fertile ground for stories of spirits, curses, and restless souls, especially on plantations where generations of trauma had left emotional scars that some believed manifested in the environment itself. Overseers often scoffed at these stories during the day, but avoided certain parts of the property at night, wary of what they might encounter. The enslaved man used this tension between skepticism and belief to shape his strategy. He understood that the overseer's fear of the supernatural was not a weakness reserved for the uneducated or the imaginative. It was a fear inherited from their families, from community tales, and from the oppressive silence that hung over land built on cruelty. Each carefully crafted disturbance he created carried an echo of these legends, ensuring that the overseers would interpret even the simplest event as something more sinister. In this way, the line between historical fact and eerie suggestion began to blur. As the overseers grew increasingly afraid, the plantation transformed into a stage where every sound, shadow, and unexplained movement seemed charged with meaning. The environment took on qualities of a horror setting, not because anything supernatural was truly happening, but because fear made the overseers interpret the ordinary as extraordinary. Trees swaying in the wind became silhouettes of figures watching them. The rustling of animals in the brush sounded like someone following their steps. Lanterns flickering in the dark appeared to signal hidden messages. The enslaved man did not need to fabricate terror. He only needed to highlight what the environment already offered. The overseer's dread amplified every detail until the plantation felt alive with threats they could not see or name. This layering of psychological tension over a historically brutal setting created an atmosphere that felt both real and haunting, the kind of story that stays with a listener long after it is told. This blend of fear and history also heightened the overseer's sense of vulnerability. They were used to being the enforcers, the figures of authority who instilled fear in others, yet now they found themselves reacting to shadows as if they were hunted. Their inability to understand the source of their dread made the situation feel out of their control, pushing them into a state where every moment felt like the build-up to something terrible. The enslaved man's brilliance lay in feeding their imaginations just enough to keep them on edge, letting their own fears shape the narrative. In a world where stories about haunted woods, cursed land, and restless spirits circulated freely, the overseers didn't need proof. The threat felt real because it fit the logic of the world they lived in. Their terror became its own force, spreading through their ranks and making them question everything they thought they knew about their power and their safety. The story's enduring power comes from this merging of harsh reality and atmospheric dread. It shows how fear can be stronger than weapons and how psychological pressure can unravel even the most brutal systems of control. It transforms one man's quiet rebellion into something that feels almost mythic, not because of exaggerated details, but because of the environment that shaped it, a place where history itself felt haunted and where every action carried emotional weight. The enslaved man's tactic became more than a strategy. It became a legend whispered among those who survived the era, a chilling reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were moments when the powerful found themselves afraid, unsure, and forced to confront forces they could neither see nor understand.